No one likes to be told what to do, whether it's by the government, your neighbor, or even someone that you know. There's just something most of us that object to the idea of having our freedom restricted. Underline government on that one, especially if these rules and regulations are not ones that we personally agree with. And for the most part, when it comes to things like planning disputes, the processes are long, laborious, and paperwork heavy, as well as pretty much extremely dull. But there are occasions when tempers can fray and emotions boil over with deadly results. So let's head over to the UK, and that's not a threat, to look into something that started off as a simple disagreement between a man and his local council. This would then escalate into a tense standoff, newspaper reports, television cameras, and ultimately it would end in a tragedy. This is the story of Albert Dryden and Henry Collinson. For today's story, once again, we're over in England in the UK, over in the county Durham, which somebody's gonna say I mispronounced that, located towards the northeast. County Durham is a place steeped in history with connections that spread back to before the Norman invasion in 1066. In the events since, there has been at various points that have been relatively consistent centers of various industries. There have also been things like coal mining, steelworks, and heavy engineering at various locations in the county since the Industrial Revolution altered the economic landscape in the region and further afield. It is famed in the modern day for its spectacular cathedral and known for being the home of the Durham University, a relatively renowned place of tertiary education, basically the highest of education. For those that enjoy a little more of the outdoor life, there is certainly plenty worth looking at here. The Pennines, which again, somebody's gonna say it's actually the Pennines, that doesn't sound right, are a prime spot for any hill walkers who would want to check out the local landscape and the scenery. But what we are looking at today is something pretty far removed from old stone buildings and hills. Near a small town called Consett, around 14 miles in the Lord's units, or in heathen units 23 kilometers from the city of Newcastle. It all started in the year 1940 when Albert Dryden was born on the 12th of May and was one of 8 brothers and sisters. He would spend the vast majority of his life in the area, where he would ply his trade as a steel worker for the most of his working life up until he was laid off in his 40s. But even when he was young, Albert showed a keen interest in firearms, something that would be a constant fixation throughout the rest of his life. He would get a firearms license at the age of 17 through the correct channels, but it wouldn't take long for his hobby to start straying into the more legally gray and outright criminal direction, because again, remember, you're in the UK. The police would end up raiding his family home when he was around 20 years of age, where a stash of illegal munitions were found. He had been making mortars and rockets, which were not legal. Around the same time, he found himself in hot water over allegations that he was threatening other local residents. Combined with the weapons found, this landed Albert in court, where he would have to answer for these charges. Following the initial incident, he would largely keep his nose clean when it came to the law, although it wouldn't be long before the next sticking point would end up appearing, one that would be the catalyst for the incident that we're discussing today. In the UK, as with most countries, there are some restrictions and guidelines on what exactly you can build and how you can build it, even if it's on your own land. Now, this is just me breaking in. It's one of those things that if you want to live in a nice area and you want things to not, if you don't want, like, I don't know, my shack from Fallout 4 where it was just this giant god-awful abomination in the middle of the neighborhood built, there does need to be some rules and regulations as to what you can build. But if you're out in like the middle of the desert in the southwest of the United States, man, build whatever you want, who cares? So certain structures under specific guidelines and dimensions can be built without approval, known as permitted development. But most large-scale projects need planning permission, which is granted by the council. Albert was not a man who thought very much of this process and appeared to fundamentally disagree with the whole idea. The home where he actually lived and spent most of his time was not the issue. In fact, I'm not saying it exists, but what I am saying is that you could technically add rooms into your house. You just can't label it as added rooms if you try to go sell it. So always something to remember. If you build a room in your home, destroy it after the fact if you want to sell a place. Anyhow, his own dispute was on a plot of land that was around 5 miles away that he had bought in the 1980s alongside his mother. On this piece of land, Albert had erected a number of buildings like a shed and at least 2 greenhouses. It was during this process that he had become acquainted with Henry Collinson, who also went by Harry. He was a 46-year-old father of 2 and shared Albert's love of the local area and countryside living in general. Harry worked for the council in the planning department, and at least for the first while, their interactions had been civil. Some would later state that they had actually developed a bit of a friendship with Harry's frequent visits to discuss potential plans and buildings, even if there were roadblocks and issues from the council side. Harry would advise Albert on what was possible and ways that he could go through, like planning this and still get it done while staying within regulations, and Albert was, for the most part, compliant. The real real issue arose when Albert decided to build a bungalow or single-story house on his land, except his idea was to build it in such a way that it was sank almost entirely into the ground with only the roof showing. This was understandably not a very usual suggestion and one that fell well outside the normal guidelines for buildings. Why not just build a ranch and have a basement? Who knows? So the council stated that this would be illegal and refused planning. Albert built it anyway, and what followed was a long back and forth while both parties grew more and more frustrated as the dispute dragged on. During this time, Albert's mother would end up passing away, and despite her advanced years, this stress of planning dispute and all the legal wrangling would be what he blamed for her demise, and his anger and frustration would continue to grow here. He would start to dig trenches and ditches all over his property and erect fences and barriers to keep others out. A notice would be issued by the council that demanded he tear this illegal building down, which he refused to even do in the first place because, again, his thinking was, well, this is my land. He argued that since all of the building was underground, it would be not subject to normal building regulations. The only next step to them was to go and enforce the notice by demolishing the bungalow with or without his permission. Due to the increasingly erratic behavior of Albert and what he was showing, members of the council suggested bringing in the bulldozers under the cover of darkness, which is entirely sketch, when he was sleeping in his home 5 miles away and getting the job done without the risk of confrontation. This is a stupid idea. Harry Collinson believed this to be dirty and underhanded, and it is. This is, okay, look man, I get along with government for the most part, and I don't think anybody really 100% is like totally on board with what's going on in any part of the country, no matter the country, right? But this is just bizarre. This is like, you're going onto somebody's land and destroying something. I get that, like, you know, you need to do it, and it's not so much that it needs to be done, it's how you're doing it that's a bit of a problem. So despite their recent more frayed relationship, he felt it was only fair to perform this very final enforcement in the clear light of day, that being Harry trying to add some, you know, clarity to the situation of that is psychotic to do. So the events of that day, it isn't really to say that Harry was completely blind to the potential for there to be some sort of conflict concerning this entire outcome. The ongoing dispute in the bizarre sunken house had already drawn the attention of local media, and given the final nature of the demolition and partially for the protection of the workers that were going to carry out the work, Harry enlisted a number of news reporters, including a camera crew, as well as members of the police to attend alongside the demolition crew. The date is the 21st of June, 1991, and heavy machinery arrived on site alongside Harry with the TV crew. Following them were members of the police and some interested locals who were interested to see how it would actually go down bright and early at 9 a.m. Albert appeared and went straight to the fence line where the workers were. He saw Harry and approached him. It would later transpire that Harry thought there was a real possibility that Albert would actually react so poorly that the police and attendants would have to intervene, send the workers away, and then the courts would be forced to enforce the demolition in a more safe and controlled manner, maybe even with Albert forcibly kept away. What he couldn't have expected was for that Albert to pull a gun and shoot him point blank. The reporters, workers, and police scrambled for safety, and Albert fired a number of follow-up shots. One hit a retreating officer, another clipped a reporter. A police car containing 2 officers was forced to reverse away at a speed to kind of get away from the gunfire, and he approached some of the demolition machinery and fired a couple of rounds into it. He then went back to the ditch where Collinson had fallen and shot him another 2 times as he lay already dead. Albert then went back into the house with his firearm, and emergency services were called for backup. An ambulance came and medical treatment was given to the wounded parties, but Harry Collinson died at the scene from multiple gunshot wounds. The camera crew stayed in place to record what had now become an intense standoff. There was some negotiation between 2 parties through a telephone line that was set up to actually allow for them to speak. At one point, sometime after 11 o'clock in the morning, Albert would come back to the fence line to speak with law enforcement negotiators in person. One of the officers noticed that he hadn't brought his gun and promptly jumped on him, subduing him and then taking him in custody. The standoff would finally be over and a trail of destruction lay behind him. But before we move on to the aftermath and the conclusion of this incident, it is always worth looking into similar incidents because people absolutely lose it sometimes, especially when dealing with the, I don't know, bureaucratic machine. Like, look, I'm not trying to be like, oh, you know, government, blah, 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 but it's like, we all need to follow the laws, right? But it's like, I get it. You shouldn't just drop people, obviously, but it's like the frustration associated with dealing with a faceless and nameless kind of entity that is dictating how you can and can't do anything. Sometimes it's a little difficult to deal with, and some people absolutely lose it. And also, just so you know, like, these are topics that we may cover ourselves at a later date, or possibly even just ones for you to research if this has piqued your interest. It'd be easy for people who do not live in the UK to think that guns simply are not a thing in the country, anniversary, but you'd be wrong. In fact, a statistic in the first quarter of 2023 suggested that there were in excess of 600,000 legally held firearms in England and Wales alone. It is true that there are stricter gun controls than many other countries, and simply owning a firearm for the sake of owning one is relatively rare. Most belong to farmers, sport shooters, or are used for legitimate pest control. And other legally held guns in the UK are held by a person who has been granted the proper certification and has proved to the police that they have met certain criteria. They are also subject to regular inspections and can have that right withdrawn at any time if they do breach certain conditions. That isn't to say the UK has not seen plenty of tragic incidents involving guns over the year. One of the catalysts for tighter gun controls, one that saw the ownership of handguns actually majorly restricted, was one that we have covered on this channel, which was the Dunblane Massacre, which if you haven't seen that video, I will actually link it at the end of this one. But for everybody who just wants like the quick and dirty of what that was, this occurred in Dunblane near Stirling, Scotland on the 13th of March, 1996, where a man named Thomas Hamilton fired on a bunch of younglings in the local school, eventually taking out 16 of them, one teacher and then himself. Another incident of note was the spree killer named Roanoke, who shot at his ex-girlfriend and her new partner, killing the partner and then putting his former lover in hospital. Moat had a turbulent past and had not been long released from prison when he started his rampage, using a sawed-off shotgun as his weapon of choice. After this initial shooting, he opened fire on random parked police car where he shot and blinded one of the officers. What followed became known as the 2010 Northumbria police manhunt, as multiple officers from all forces were collectively searching for Raoul, who was on the run and had threatened to shoot and kill any officer that approached him. That's a good way to just get domed immediately on the spot if you're identified. In the end though, after 6 days on the run and a bizarre intervention from a former footballer, Paul Goskeen, at least I believe that's how you pronounce his name, Roanoke would take his own life via self-inflicted shotgun wound. So rather than turn this section into a list of spree and serial killings, which I'm not really sure you guys are interested, we'll mention just one more and then get back to the aftermath of what happened to Albert Dryden. Final example occurred in Portsmouth, which I now know how to say, when Jake Davidson shot and killed 5 people, including his own mother, with a firearm that he legally owned for turning it on himself. He had in fact had his license revoked briefly due to concerns, but had it returned to him shortly before the incident. In the aftermath of this incident, I guess what would be colloquially known as the incel adjacent views that had basically been shared by him on his own YouTube channel and in forums was the focus of the media when they tried to determine what caused this rampage. This also led to a review of the way in which firearms licenses are assessed, awarded, and regulated. And of course, I'm gonna jump in real quick and say this, which is just me ad-libbing as per usual. One of the problems I think that we're facing in general with all of these is the media trying to figure out, oh, well, why did they do it? Who were they? What's their story? Blah, what's their name? You're making these people famous. And when you make them famous, it makes other people who might want to check out anyways or do something crazy also want to be remembered and be famous. I think one of the biggest things that we could probably do as a society as a whole is when somebody does crap like this, you don't say their name, you don't show who they look like, you basically say, you give them a name and a very, very generic name, John Doe number 46. That way, nobody knows who they are, nobody knows what they're about, you don't really go and look at their views and see if they should be famous or any of this crap. A lot of this, I think, is predicated on the idea that, oh, well, I'm gonna be able to be remembered, and the media plays directly into that. But that's just my own personal opinion. I could be wrong, but that's just how I see it. Stop making them famous, and it'll probably happen less. But now, we'll get back to today's story and see what happened after killing. So when it comes to the aftermath of this shooting of Henry Collinson, it's fair to say that this was front page news. After all, while it may not seem that way from the examples we've just gone over, shootings are relatively rare in the UK as a whole, far less than the ones that occur in the presence of television cameras in front of journalists and also involve pot shots being taken at officers in attendance. It meant that the story spread everywhere and it spread really fast. Interest in the man behind the shooting and the botched planning debate that seemed to be the cause of it grew nationwide. When police searched the house after the fact, they found large amounts of handmade illegal ammunition. The type that had been used to shoot Harry and other victims were of his own construction. He had called them his man stoppers, which is a bit strange. He also had a small arsenal of other largely illegal munitions and firearms. The gun he used that day had been one of the first he had ever owned, sold to him by a school friend who had stolen it when he was young. The age of the weapon meant that there was no commercially available ammunition for it, and this is perhaps what started him down his lifelong obsession with manufacturing and creating his own weapons and ammo. It should be noted that while all of it is, of course, highly illegal, it was commented on by many who examined his creations that he did possess a talent for it. He could have gone into ammo making, he could have gone into selling firearms legally, he could have done literally anything else rather than throwing his life away doing this crap. But again, again, you cannot get lost in the sauce when you're arguing with the government. It's hard to do because as people, we like to individually focus on one. Like if I'm focusing with you and I'm being stopped because of all these other people in the background, but you are the focal point, it's human nature to be angry at that one person in front of you. But it's important to remember it's an entire entity that you're dealing with. And yes, that entity does suck a lot of times when it comes to planning, but it's not worth getting this upset about. So when combined with his increasingly erratic behavior, arguing with other locals and digging large ditches and trenches all over his property, the discovery of these weapons cache was alarming to some. Albert Dryden would then go to court charged with the murder of Harry Collinson, as well as wounding and attempting murder of Colin Campbell and Tony Belmont, police officer, and the reporter he shot at during the incident. He would receive a life sentence for the murder as well as 7 years for the wounding and attempted murders. After his trial at Newcastle Crown Court, he would begin his sentence in April of 1992. There would be an appeal lodged, but this would be rejected. He would also apply for parole a number of times over the years, but this would always be refused, as well as it should be, because you did kill someone. During his time in jail, he would never once express any remorse over the killing that he had carried out, and it was noted that his mental health only seemed to slide further downhill as the years passed and he aged further. His physical health would actually begin to rapidly deteriorate, and he suffered a number of strokes. The decision was made to release him from prison in 2017 on a compassionate grounds due to these ongoing and worsening health conditions. By this point, he had served 25 years behind bars and was in his late 70s. Albert Dryden was then transferred from prison to care home, where he would pass away the next year on the 18th of September 2018 at the age of 78. When it comes to the legacy of this shooting, what really amounts to the murder of Harry Collinson, it would be expected that when we looked into people's opinions on the whole thing, they would probably be generally in agreement that most people would believe something along the lines of basic fact that it is not morally justified to just take a man's life, especially not because you believe that they are gleefully enforcing draconian planning restrictions on you. And while this is admittedly the majority position, there are some corners of the internet and some opinions and forums and discussions that tout a completely different viewpoint. Ones that view Albert Dryden as almost a folk hero of sorts. They believed that he was a man that was pushed to the extreme by a thoughtless and overreaching council, one that targeted him in particular and tried everything in their power to limit and control what he could and couldn't do on his own land. And while it is difficult to try and justify the actions that Albert took that day, there are some points to this argument that deserve a little more analysis. It seems to come down to the very basic question of whether or not some branch of local government, in this case a council, should be allowed to have such a strong and final say in what you are permitted to do on land that you legally own. Those that are for the enforcement of strict planning guidelines and controls over affairs like this believe that without them, the countryside would soon be a mess of dangerous and poorly constructed buildings, or ones that discharged raw waste into critical waterways, ones that tarnish the landscape and damage the ecosystem. Others believe that while there has to be some oversight about what everyone can and cannot do, it should be sensible and open to appeal. And others believe that is a man's God-given right to do pretty much with whatever they want to do with the land, they can do with it because they own it. And whatever side of the debate you find yourself on, there is no doubt that you would be able to pretty easily find evidence that would justify your position. It should go without saying that even if you do believe that the council had no right to try and bulldoze Albert's buildings, that they were bullying him, or maybe that they were abusing their powers, there was no need for a man's life to be lost that day, certainly not the way that it was. So there you have it, the whole story of the murder of Harry Collinson by Albert Dryden, a planning dispute that escalated way out of control. Let me know what you think down in the comments, what your thoughts are. There should be no doubt in anyone's mind that the taking of life is never justified, especially in this circumstance. But was Albert a man driven to distraction by oppressive regulations and restrictions who made an admittedly rash decision, or was he someone who was a danger to society as a whole and one that needed to be put behind bars? Where you fall in the debate will depend hugely on how you feel about to what extent the government councils should have an input on what you can and cannot do with the land you own. So this is where I'm going to break in for a moment, as always, because I've always got opinions on the matter. Look, I think government is not infallible, obviously, because government is simply an expression of human nature, which is also not infallible. And I believe in a lot of ways, government tries to act in a way that is fair to all, right? In some instances. Obviously, that is not true across the board. And don't call me a Fed because of this. I'm just saying, take it with a grain of salt. But typically, what causes people to make it fair is they don't care, right? Going to the DMV, there's the same rules, same regulations, same everything across the board for everybody because they don't care, right? There's no personal stake in it for them specifically. And because of that, they're able to make decisions decisions somewhat rationally. Now, the problem is that when it goes from the I don't care and apathetic into this guy's now annoying and let's get him back, that's when the other part of human nature comes in. And considering the disputes that they were having with the council, or considering the disputes Albert Dryden was having with the council, it's very likely they were becoming annoyed at him at this point. Going under the cover of darkness and destroying his building is psychotic. Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. That is not an apathetic response. That is a targeted response, at least in my opinion. Now, should he have built it in the first place? No, he didn't have permission to do it. But this targeted response is no longer apathetic. And when it becomes no longer apathetic or emotionless, that's when you need to question what the government organization as a whole is doing. So as long as the same rules and regulations apply to everybody across the board, then they're not malicious. But when they become targeted, even if it's the enforcement of already standing rules, then they become malicious. It's like that guy who welded a bunch of armoring onto the bulldozer. The city council that was there was screwing with him. I can't remember the context of it, and that's why I don't believe anybody died. I can't remember. Might do a video on that, but that's why he went and destroyed the city council, because it was a targeted response at that point. And you have to understand also, in general, with elected officials, because I'm not going to call them leaders, they're elected officials, there is power associated with that. And what is it? Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, or absolutely corrupts, or something like that. The point is that people get a little bit of power, you know, they might start thinking, well, hey, you know, everybody else underneath me is small, or they're controllable, or XYZ, and they might start changing a little bit. That's why you need to have a system of checks and balances in place. So the question is, should they have discussed coming onto his land at night to bulldoze it while he was away? No, that is insane to do. That is crossing a line, which kind of shows your hand a little bit. Should he have built it? No, he shouldn't have. And he most certainly shouldn't have dropped Harry in the process because he was angry about this. There's different types of things you could do. So this kind of shows that Albert Dryden was not really playing with a full deck of cards either. So the whole situation, cooler heads should have prevailed, but it didn't, at least in my opinion. But if you have a suggestion on what you would like for me to cover in the future, please leave it down below. Other than that, I appreciate you guys watching, and I hope you enjoyed learning about this. If you did, please give it a like or a thumbs up or whatever it is, and subscribe if you would like to hear more stories like this. Also, I would like to thank my patrons real quick. At the literal Wendigo tier, we have Grayson, West, Invictus Echo, Michigan Dogman, Monkey Man, and Scrungle. Thank you guys for your awesome support. Next, I'd like to thank our Eyewitness to the Event tier. We have Beaver Malaga and Dragon Master Knights. Thank you guys. At the secondhand accounts tier, we have Bianca, Fred Rush, Stutz, and Troy. And to the rest of my patrons, I do appreciate y'all's support as well. It goes a long way towards helping out, so thank you. But all right, that's going to do it for me. Everyone enjoyed, and we'll see y'all in the next one.